Board. Hello, Sunday Breakfast Club members. Chris Satullo here with the second episode of our new series of interviews with key members of the club and their thoughts on our theme of recovery with equity. Today's guest is Malcolm Ingram. He's an associate with Jackson Lewis Law Firm in Philadelphia. Welcome, Malcolm.
Hey, Chris, thank you for having me.
Well, thanks very much for pausing in your busy day to talk with us. As you know, Malcolm, our theme is recovery with equity this year, looking at multiple aspects of the pandemic and the economic chaos and harm that it's caused in some quarters. And clearly the pandemic almost overnight in March sort of scrambled the standard work day for millions of people and hundreds of thousands in this region. And all of a sudden things about work were very different. Things about the employer-worker connection and sort of compact were being readjusted on the fly. What would you say are some of the biggest aspects of that you're seeing in your work?
I think working remotely is probably the biggest aspect because of some of the local, state, and federal ordinances that came down at the beginning of the pandemic and that are still in effect at the moment. You've seen the workforce, go from working in large office spaces consistently to working almost exclusively from home. As we continue to open up slowly, I think you're going to see some industries go back into the workplace, like restaurants, as you see now. But I do think going forward, the days of employees and employers requiring employees to actually come to work in a physical workspace 5 days a week are long gone. A lot of companies are struggling right now, but there are also a lot of companies that have been able to pivot and thrive remotely. And I think that they've noticed that there's also an ability to cut costs in terms of office space and expenses related to office space.
Have you heard from any of your clients that they're discovering that at least parts of their workforce are surprisingly more productive, doing everything on Zoom?
I am. We definitely are seeing that. It's a mixed bag, I'll be honest. It's more or less industry specific. So we are seeing that. We're also hearing from some of the employers and clients that their employees complain that the days kind of blend together, really, right? You wake up, you log in, you don't have to worry about getting dressed. You can work instead of from 9 to 5, people are now working from 8 to 7 because you don't have to go anywhere, right? And the work can keep coming in and you have to worry about commuting home. So one of the downsides I'll say is that separating your home from your work. Mm-hmm.
Now, what about the question of coming back and employees who either have concerns about their health because of the persistence of the pandemic or just really loved working from home and think they're more productive there? How's that conversation going between an employer who's saying, time to come back, and an employee who's saying, wait a second, can we talk about this?
Great question, Chris. And I think this is going to be the leading question or leading issue as we prepare to return back to work during and post-COVID-19. So those conversations have to be fluid, right? And it's going to depend on a lot of factors. But the most important factor is going to be when the employee requests to continue to work from home remotely, what's the reason behind it? The employee mentions that they have a disability or they're requesting an accommodation because of a disability, then employers are required to engage in the interactive process, which is basically a fancy way of saying, have a conversation on what the employer can do on their end to meet the employee's request or what they can't do. I think a lot of employers potentially may get in trouble when they don't engage in that conversation, right? If an employee requests an accommodation, the employer says, no, you have to come back to work. And then the employee says, I can't, I'm concerned about my health, and you terminate. I think you're going to see a disability lawsuit as a result of that, and it'll be a pretty strong lawsuit. If an employee says, I'm scared to come back into work and doesn't actually give you the reason behind it, again, employers should engage in the conversation and make sure the reason behind that fear is not a disability, right? On the other side, if an employee says, look, I've been thriving working at home for the last 10 months, I'm more effective at home. If the employer actually sees that and can verify that, I think they should give it a shot. Even if they can't verify, I think it's something they should consider, really, because other employees are going to make similar requests. And if it actually could help save the employers money in the long run and also help with morale.
The other thing that's a huge factor here and a potential wild card going forward is parents of school-age children, any children who either need daycare or go to school. You've got right now a patchwork quilt all over our region, some districts in hybrid mode, some in complete virtual mode. How does that come into the workplace when you might have parents coming from all over the region, and they've got very different circumstances that you're trying to cope with, so there's no one size fits all?
That's right. So there can't be a one size fits all approach. And because of some of the laws that are in place, there are certain things that employers must do when employees come to them and say, I need an accommodation because I'm caring for my child, or my child is now working from home or studying from home now because of the pandemic. Depending on the employer side, certain laws apply, really, right? And employees are actually able to take paid leave under certain laws, right? Depending on the size of their employer, where they work, and etc. But again, the employers are going to have to be flexible and know the laws that apply to them, right? One thing we saw was the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, which increased the reasons an employee could take leave under the Family and Medical Leave Act, right? And an example is if a school's child is closed because of COVID-19 or the pandemic, and they have less than 500 employees, they could take additional leave under the FMLA, right? And it's paid leave at 2/3 pay up to 12 weeks, right? But it doesn't apply to employers who have greater than 500 employees, and there's also a carve out for employers that have less than 50 employees, right? But again, employers are gonna have to be flexible, listen to what their employees are saying to them, and then adjust accordingly. It can't be a rigid approach. I think taking a rigid approach increases liability and also hurts morale. I think if employers listen to their employees and make decisions that are based on what's best for the company and the best for their employees, I think they'll make the right decision. But I'd encourage in situations where employees request leave to help care for children because of the school system, at least contact their lawyers, because it's going to be a very detailed or very fact-specific analysis that needs to be done.
Another thing I've seen some coverage of is workplace feud brewing between employees who have children and employees who are single or don't have children. And the employees who are childless feeling that there are special accommodations being made for the person in the next cubicle that aren't available to them and feel like that's discriminatory.
I haven't seen any lawsuits based on that. I'll tell you right now, I am aware of employers who are concerned about employees with children who are having to do multiple things. Or they have to work their job and come and perform at a high level while fix lunch for children, prepare kids for school, and make sure they're doing their homework, and sometimes teach the kids because the kids aren't learning as effectively via Zoom as they did in person, right? And doing all that is time consuming, it's stressful. On the flip side, employees who don't have children have to go through that. I don't know if there's going to be so much of jealousy, but they may not be able to relate in the same way because they haven't experienced that struggle. I will say employers are some of the employers that I counsel have put into place employee hotlines. They put into place virtual daycare centers for employees to help mitigate that issue and that potential conflict. And those have been effective, but it still doesn't replace in-person learning, unfortunately. But it is something that can help ease the burden, the stress on employees who are feeling overwhelmed because of everything they have to do now with their children learning from home.
One of the upsides, if you could call anything an upside of the pandemic, was that it tended to shine an appreciative spotlight on a lot of people who do really essential work day after day that we didn't particularly notice or appreciate before, like the people who stock the shelves and all the people who sort of make sure our consumer society gets the goods and services it needs. It also, though, shone a spotlight on how kind of tattered their safety net can be, particularly for things like sick leave. So how do you see the experience of a huge national public health crisis sort of shining a light on what actually is available to a supermarket worker or a line worker in a warehouse, an Amazon warehouse? Do you see real changes coming?
I'm honestly not sure, and it really just depends on the funds that are available from the employer and from the government. It's a constant struggle, I'll say, because these employees are our heroes. They're keeping everything going during the pandemic. But what comes into play when employers consider giving additional compensation or additional leave is what type of burden it places on the employer. I think employers are going to have to think long and hard about what the bottom line is and how much they're willing to move to accommodate these employees who are keeping the company going. I think some companies who are making huge profit margins have just put the extra pay in place. They want to reward these employees for keeping the company going and allowing them to realize those profit margins. But it's not going to be the same for every company. I know nonprofits that provide essential services that are struggling right now because they just don't have that type of additional income to provide to their employees, or their employees are doing technically God's work, So it's going to be different based on industry and based on funds available. But I do think those employees who are going out night and day, no matter what the circumstances are, putting their lives at risk, should be compensated appropriately and fairly, and also at the same time given the ability to protect themselves from the virus.
Now, no one at this point, outside of maybe Nate Silver at 538.com, knows how this election is exactly going to turn out. It seems like there's a possibility that in some places, more progressive majorities might be taking over state houses or Congress. And we certainly saw some examples of that with city council in recent years, particularly after the last council election, where there's sort of a more aggressive progressive majority there looking to do more around minimum wage and sick leave and things like that. So do you have any crystal ball about what we might see coming next year in terms of just ideas or proposals around these issues?
I think you will see more regarding sick leave and paid sick leave. I think you'll see a lot of laws being considered and implemented for the gig economy. The same time that the employers of companies have kept the company going during the pandemic, so have gig workers. They're providing food, they're driving vehicles, they're providing groceries to houses to allow people to stay in their houses and not have to expose themselves to the virus, all without receiving benefits like employees of companies generally do, or the same type of healthcare. So I think you'll see going forward a push to help provide benefits and additional compensation for gig workers so that they can continue to thrive and help keep the country going. It's something that's been in the works or people have talked about, but wasn't really on the forefront until the pandemic hit and people said or saw how effective gig workers were without having the same type of protection as employees of companies.
So I'm glad you brought the gig economy up, Malcolm. I recall in the second term of the Obama administration, they were really cracking down on the mislabeling of employees. And, there were really beginning to implement much stricter regulations about what qualified someone as an independent contractor. I was at WHYY at the time. We used a lot of freelance journalists, and we were just having to rewrite all those contracts and really re-examine how we did business because of that. Now, when Donald Trump was elected, that all kind of went poof. Mm-hmm. But as you mentioned, we're 4 years later, far deeper into the gig economy, far more thought going into how essential those people have become. Again, the crystal ball, where do you think protections for independent contractors might be going in the future?
I think you'll see companies who employ independent contractors being told or laws coming down to say these actual independent contractors are technically employees. There's consistent or constant litigation against some of these larger gig companies from the gig workers saying we want benefits or we're entitled to certain benefits that employees of the large employers work, right? Though there's not the same relationship there, these companies generally have these workers sign very lengthy indemnification contracts. I think you're going to see a lot of litigation about that. And I think you're going to see some of these employees win on some of these lawsuits and get some of these benefits, or you're going to see laws come down that actually protect these companies. We'll see, but I think that's going to come down no matter what.
Right.
I know recently, I believe some of the gig workers were allowed to actually get unemployment compensation during the pandemic, I believe. That's just an example of one of the things I think you'll see come down more and more in the future.
Now, one thing that happens then, a legislature can pass a law, a governor can sign it, it can be enacted, and then when the first dispute comes up, it goes to the courts.
That's right.
If it's going to the federal courts, it's going to be going to a much more conservative judiciary than we
Right.
saw 4 years ago. So, just in terms of case law and precedent, which way is the wind blowing?
It's going to depend on who the case falls in front of. And with these lawsuits, you might notice, you might get familiar. People tend to file lawsuits like this in certain jurisdictions, depending on to help shape the outcome, right? And it's also going to depend on what judge you get in front of. The law is going to be the law, but certain jurisdictions take a more liberal, a more conservative approach. I do acknowledge that the judiciary will be much more conservative based on the number of federal judges our president's been able to appoint during his 4 years. But you really just have to see how it plays out when the case is brought to the judge in that circuit in particular. Because if it's brought in the Eastern District, which is the Third Circuit, the outcome could be different as opposed to if it's brought in the Ninth Circuit in California, right? So it's really going to depend. I think for the very talented and plaintiffs' attorneys, they'll be very conscious about where they file these lawsuits, right?
Okay, to that point, do you feel comfortable saying anything about where the Eastern District and the Third Circuit sit on that spectrum of leaning one way or another?
I can't comment on the Third Circuit. I'll say I practice there regularly, but I will say I think you'll see a lot of this litigation in the Ninth Circuit. For Uber and Lyft, you've seen a lot of litigation in the Ninth Circuit, and those companies are booming there. So I think you'll see lawsuits regarding the gig economy there, especially because California's laws are much more employee and worker friendly.
Mm-hmm. And another related issue to the pandemic is many of the workers we've been discussing end up being on the front lines of human contact, or in the case of notoriously the meat packing plant employees just working in an assembly line environment where distancing isn't possible, really, practically. So there's that whole issue of employer liability for exposure to the virus. Mm-hmm. Where does that stand now? Is there any settled law around that, or is that fluid?
It is tricky. That's another great question, Chris. What you are seeing, I'm hearing a lot about is our COVID-19 waivers, right? I don't think they're extremely effective. I mean, I think people and companies implement COVID-19 waivers as another way to insulate themselves, but there's certain things you just can't waive. If an employee says they have a disability, which is preventing them from coming to work, you can't make them waive that, really, right? So overly broad COVID-19 waivers aren't going to have any effect. Also, if an employee comes to the workplace and later contracts COVID-19, because of where we're at with contract tracing, it's going to be hard to determine if the employee actually caught COVID-19 in the workplace, right? But even if they did, generally that's going to trigger, at least in Pennsylvania, workers' comp to kick in and help, with the employee while they're out recovering from COVID-19. Social distancing in the workplace is going to be tough in industries like manufacturing. I think you are going to see companies put into place a lot of PPE, where it's plexiglass, specific masks to help prevent, employees from breathing in air that might be infected with COVID-19. But it's going to be very tricky, especially for those manufacturing jobs. You might see the manufacturing jobs actually lessen the amount of employees they have on the floor at one time to help increase the amount of distance the employees can keep from one another. But they're going to have to be very, very creative. And again, it's going to be industry specific. It's going to depend on the the margins, the profit margins, and what they can do to keep the facility going.
I wanted to sort of switch gears a little bit. Our theme of recovery with equity also includes a broad look at equity. And obviously, the nation is going through some ferment, kind of reckoning and awakening around some issues of social justice and racism that maybe hadn't been fully absorbed by some Americans before. And this comes hard on the heels of a couple of years ago, we went through a similar awakening and reckoning around sexual harassment in the workplace. So in terms of going forward, coming out of this, people may be returning to work together, in the same office in some way or shape or form. How do you see employers wanting to adjust and needing to adjust around issues of implicit bias, harassment, racism?
Sure, sure, sure. Great question again, Chris. You're going to see, I think from a lot of employers, you're going to see a lot more dialogue in the workplace about what implicit bias looks like, and on a day-to-day basis. You're also going to see employers look to hire directors of diversity and inclusion to help implement ideas and programs to ensure equity in the workplace, or chief diversity and inclusion officers. 2020 has been branded the year of the diversity and inclusion officer because of what's going on across the country. One of the things you see employers do to ensure and to show that they're actually committed to diversity and inclusion is make the chief diversity and inclusion officer report directly to the CEO. That way the change and the diversity and inclusion goals are coming from the top down, and it shows that the company's taking it seriously. I've seen a lot of dialogue and heard a lot of things from companies where they also pledge money to diverse causes to ensure diversity, inclusion, and equity. We'll see what happens with that. What I'm hoping to see, I'll tell you, Chris, though, is that it's not an aesthetic fix, right? What happens after the killing of George Floyd, you see a lot of companies come out and say what they're going to do, and they're pledging money, and all these things sound great, but what happens 6 months from now, right? Will people still have that same energy or that same desire to take a deep look in the mirror and make those really genuine fixes? I'm hoping so. I'm really hoping so. But I guess only time will tell what happens.
In terms of being really helpful to the club members who we hope will watch this video, it's a hard question, I acknowledge, but do you personally, can you suggest any sort of benchmarks or sort of telltale signs that help somebody distinguish whether an organization is just indulging in eyewash or is serious about what it's doing?
Sure. I'll give you one telltale sign. So the money is great. People always say we're going to donate money to an organization, but sometimes that's the easy part, right? I just write a check and forget about doing anything. Hey, I gave money, so I don't have to do anything else. Usually when you see someone genuinely committed, it's a constant conversation. Companies are focusing on retention, right? So they're bringing in diverse talent, but they're not letting them walk out the door. They're focused on retention, developing and grooming these diverse talent so they can put themselves in places to succeed, and then rewarding the diverse talent when they do a good job, right? So I think what you want to see are measurable steps where an organization puts into place a diversity and inclusion plan that's measurable, and they track themselves as they progress on this plan, whether they're progressing as they hoped or what they need to continue to work on. But if you just have a goal that's not really measurable, it's an easy way to get around actually making any concrete real progress.
So I know my friend Emmy Miller, who's a member of the club and does a lot of corporate consulting around these issues, I think she's sending me vibes right now to bring this up, that one of the key differences in the success of employees moving into an environment, particularly where they may be, in some way typed as an inclusion hire, is the quality and the duration of the onboarding process. Are they really, is the company, that's one of the signs of whether a company's serious. Are they throwing people into the fire and then going, oh, they didn't work out? Or are they really being intentional and thoughtful about how do we give this new person, and this goes for all employees, but
that's right,
goes for people who may be bringing different background, different experience, different culture into a business place, and they want that different outlook to succeed. But if you kind of say, well, you're here now,
that's right.
Leave them to sink or swim. That's another sign that you're not really serious about this, or at least you're not very good at it.
That's right. You have to put work in to retain good talent, diverse or not, right? You have to put that hard work in, and it's going to be tough now with COVID and everyone working remotely. Onboarding in person is not the same as onboarding via Zoom. You don't get to build those relationships that you could build in person. So I think there needs to be even a greater intent to make sure you're reaching out to people who are coming on now to make sure they're comfortable, that they understand how the organization works, and that they're supported.
Well, Malcolm, I'm sort of coming into sight of the end of my questions, but are there any issues or questions that I should have asked you that I ineptly failed to ask?
No. You did. It was a great interview. I really appreciate your time, Chris, and thank you for having me.
Okay, I wasn't fishing for a compliment there. I just wanted to make sure I didn't leave anything important on the table. Again, we've been talking with Malcolm Ingram, an associate with Jackson Lewis, specializing in employment law. Um, we thank you very much for spending some time with us today, Malcolm. And please, if you enjoyed this interview, club members, look for future ones. Next up on our interview schedule is Lori Jones, who recently took over at Phil Abundance. So we'll be talking about hunger and food insecurity in the region and what we as members of the club can help her combat that. Also on the docket fairly soon will be Jeff DeMasi, who I call one of Philadelphia's Renaissance men. He runs a tech company. He leads Ignite Philly. He leads the Philadelphia Junto, and he's also an expert in co-working. So hope to have a wide-ranging conversation with him. Again, thanks so much, Malcolm, for
Thank
being
you,
here.
Chris. Take care.